Well, hello. How are you?
Hi. Hi. Happy holidays, whatever.
Thank you. So we covered a lot of ground 2 years ago when we first did this, and
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember because it's too long ago. And I
yeah,
also talked to Jeremy Johnson about the same time, and so the two Skype interviews sort of blend in my memory as one conversation. So I may be repetitive and write it off to being just an old fart.
well, I think the first time, just to catch everybody else up as well. We had a lot of conversation about the nature of catastrophe in
Oh, okay.
in the shift between epochs, and we talked about we criticized nerd rapturism and singularitarianism as misplaced concreteness, putting transcendence on some timeline on a future horizon.
Yeah. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about your work with Lindisfarne and where you feel the long-term successes have been for you with that.
Okay.
And we spoke a little bit about your stance relative to the integral philosophy movement and your criticism of Ken Wilber and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to take it in a much more focused direction this time. And I want to specifically address something that you and I have been kind of going back and forth on by email and in
Google Glass and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, about the relationship between ourselves and our technologies and the entelechy specifically, and the way that we can responsibly and sustainably navigate this crisis so that when we come out the other side, we're not we haven't lost as much as we've gained, that we've
Yeah. Yeah, well, those are good questions, and I definitely have thoughts on all of that are different from the kind of nerd rapturism as we were calling it. I guess it was Kevin Kelly's phrase of the rapture of the nerds with Ray Kurzweil's vision that we're going to download the soul into a computer in 2025, 2030. He, like all prophets, he makes a mistake of giving a date, turning a transformation into an event, which is in itself temporal misplaced concreteness. So that's obviously not going to happen. It's going to come and go just like K2 or the December 21st, 2012, this big event that if you surfed on YouTube, everybody was waiting for, the flying saucers land, the Earth's magnetic field to shift, the ice to drop, and nothing happened, and of course, when nothing happens, they don't change their structure, they just move the horizon. I remember the Jehovah's Witnesses standing on the corner of Yonge and Avenue Road in Toronto when I was there at the time, 1984, saying the end of the world was going to be 1984 because that was that big Orwellian date. And it came and went, nothing happened. Did they change their apocalyptic imagination? No, they just moved the date further, It's like Rush Limbaugh, who says gun shootings in schools come from liberals. He isn't going to change his thought that every God-fearing, you're in Texas, which is like the capital of gun loving.
yeah.
Every God-fearing white Protestant male has got to have his arsenal. That's just his manhood. So it's us liberals in the East Coast, who want to castrate the males and take away their guns. And so nobody changes their opinion. They just add color to the structure.
Yeah, I was, at least in my generation, or at least among the kind of new agey hippie festival culture types that I've been hanging out with, there has actually been a lot of talk about, leading up to this significant date of, the solstice last year, and the passage of that date and the relative bump, that issue. Did something happen? Was it an inflection point? And it was a mistake to think it was this epical thing, Stan Groff talked about it in terms of archetypal astrology, and he said that, you're looking at, when you're talking about cosmic issues, you're looking at stuff that is unspooling itself over what could be millennia, and it's a mistake to try and wrap it inside your own egoic horizon. But nonetheless, there has been, I've noticed a shift in the community that I've been hanging out with in terms of a movement from this apocalypticism and this kind of apocalyptic attitude to one that's like, well, we live in that future now, and it's time to take personal responsibility. So that's been a big, a central feature in the talks that I've sat in on and I've participated in, and it's sort of.
This isn't unique to your generation, because before you, back in the 70s, there were these utopian apocalyptic communities. Orville, the mother, was not going to die. She was going to change her cells and become, immortal, and she died dead, and I visited her before she died and went to Orville and in India. And then there was Findhorn, that started out as a flying saucer contactee point of opening to our space brothers. And as that didn't evolve, they evolved into an ecological community. I had something to do with that, I can say. And they shifted their emphasis to more immanential issues of what it means to be a spiritual community and living, in Gary Snyder's phrase, living lightly on the earth. And they changed completely, and they're still going. But now they're kind of a retirement community for people of my generation. It's filled up with people who are frozen in time from that 70s moment. They even wear the Icelandic sweaters that were popular in the 70s and earth shoes and almost bell bottoms. It's like they're locked into their moment, because each generation has its wave that it rides, its zeitgeist. And it can be some that's the 60s or, the 70s, and Burning Man seems to be it for your generation and other young people I know who were at Burning Man. And so that those things are formative of a generation saying, this is our thing, whether it's Bob Dylan, the Beatles, or whatever. And that's normal. That's with every generation.
Yeah. But I would say that as far as the wave that my generation in particular is riding, I was actually on the call with Mitch Mignano right before you called.
Yeah, I was thinking of Mitch, because he came to Lindisfarne, and he's a burner. Yeah,
and he says hello, and it's something that he and I talk about a lot is the actual nature, the specific qualitative nature that will be historically remembered. Something utterly beyond the propagation of the 2012 meme. When people are looking back at this time and have decided to describe it in terms of what actually did shift for us at this point, it seems that it's something that I don't know. Have you read Douglas Rushkoff's book Present Shock?
No, I've met Douglas Rushkoff. I think he's a very smart guy, and I read the one I have on my shelf is another book. I don't think it's Present Shock. But it's it's his trip.
Yeah, he talks about the sort of awkward dance that's going on now between our own internal biological rhythms and the rhythms of the global digital ecology, and how the toll that it's taking on the human organism and on our society. And one of the things that he speaks of as like one of 5 characteristics of this change in the way that we relate to time and the way that we struggle to navigate a world of digital clocks is what he calls fractal noia, which is fractal noia, like paranoia.
Oh, okay.
And what he's saying is that the information overload. I mean, this is absolutely sort of standing on Marshall McLuhan's shoulders with respect to how the information overload is causing us to, firstly, not be able to really validate the claims that we're making, not to ever get to the bottom of something and feel like we're standing on a concrete truth that that can be like finally empirically confirmed. And so the way that we generate our epistemology now is through this like schizoidal pattern recognition, which leads to a blossoming of conspiracy theory and
I'll say.
and a spike in social and individual symptoms that resemble the symptoms of like autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah. Well, some of these things may be chemical pollutants, and there are paranoid theories that it's vaccinations and all kinds of stuff, but, the jury's out, and scientifically we don't know.
Right.
But when a new evolutionary sensibility evolves from a media society, as you say, standing on Marshall shoulders, then the individual is sensitively picking up a very complex field of information that is not being reported in the news or the newspapers, where he's getting this digested paradigm. And so he or she generates these alternate visions to put it together, which takes on the structure of paranoia, where I've known some paranoids, and they'd say, look, Bill, the license plates, they're a secret code from the extraterrestrials. They're talking to us, and they're just completely, when he was off his lithium, he was just, completely psychotic. And so, but when the media are manipulating you and they're lying, then you generate an alternative vision. Take, for example, I'm old enough to remember when J. Edgar Hoover, who was not a nice man, in the McCarthy era of the 50s, had all these movies of propaganda called Your FBI and Peace and War that were popular television programs. Now what's going on? A whole raft of movies like Argo, all about showing the CIA, and according to today's internet, the homeland ends with a positive vision of how America, makes a positive difference, and the hero of the show looks like a college president and is this benign guy. Well, and Peter Dale Scott, the poet-professor from Berkeley, said the CIA killed Kennedy, through using the mafia technique that was set up to kill Castro, and it just blew back, and they used it to get rid of Kennedy. So there's a paranoid theory. But if people are in power, the best way to disempower people is say, oh, that's paranoid theory. But people unconsciously know something is going on and they're being manipulated. Mm-hmm. That movies are presenting this positive image of the CIA when they're a very destructive force. They created the mess of Iran by taking a democratically elected leader like Mossadegh and pulling him down and then making him sick and killing him, basically. And that was an MI6 and CIA maneuver. And so a lot of the truthers think they did the same thing. The American Defense Council, with the people like Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz, actually used this Pearl Harbor of 9/11 to create a phony event that was on television that manipulated the people so that we could pass the Homeland Security Act. And then following right up with it, with Obama not making a difference at all, the National Defense Authorization Act that gives him the power to assassinate an American citizen and not have to have due process of law. So, that's completely shredding the U.S. Constitution. If you've ever read the Federalist Papers and you've read Madison and all those guys, they were afraid that would happen, that they had read the classics, they were trained on Latin, they were afraid of a Caesar arising, and so they made all these checks and balances to stop that kind of tyranny. But we have what Peter Dale Scott calls the deep state. There is, some structure that is continuous. It doesn't matter who's elected. The election is just the NFL Super Bowl. It's all show business. Mm-hmm. And business goes on, and it's all about Central Asian gas pipelines controlling the growth of China and dealing with the confrontation of China and India as emergent Central Asian powers. And so Afghanistan is the battleground, not because we give a shit about the Taliban. We created the Taliban. The CIA created them. So when all that's going on and the news is complete bullshit, and people become paranoid because it's a function of the human imagination, and it has its shadow side of over-interpretation, and it has its positive side of understanding deeper transformational processes, the way McLuhan would, or hopefully or Douglas Rushkoff. When I heard Douglas, I went up to him afterward and I said, gosh, I haven't heard, good riffs like this since I heard Marshall in Toronto. This is great stuff.
That's high praise.
I respect his work.
There are kind of two things going on here that you touch on here, and one of them is that there's a documentary about the zeitgeist of the mid-19th century called Proteus, and it's a story of the life of scientific illustrator Ernst Haeckel, who's got this iconic imagery. He was the one that was commissioned to illustrate all of the deep sea life that had been dredged up by the HMS Challenger expedition when it went around doing its scientific mission, the transoceanic mission. But it framed it in context of the telegraph cable that was laid between London and New York, and how the Challenger mission was a direct consequence of the fact that the first two times they attempted to lay this telegraph cable to connect the stock prices, that it broke, and when they had to pull it back up, it was covered in these creatures that they had never seen before. So I find it really compelling on one sense that this kind of this underlying superstructure, this shadow government, here that's sort of really the engine of social history and the continuity of power differentials, is through this sort of distributed consumptive drive, this attempt to connect everything to everything else in order to maximize its efficiency, is also what is propelling this. In Proteus, they came out very clearly and said that it is what was our entry point into an exploration of the oceanic subconscious. And that this was like the archetype here that it was basically our greed and our economic system that led us to this sort of numinous, abyssal sublime.
Imaginary landscapes, that evil is the enunciation of the next level of organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so something can start out as the Viking terror and become the structure of Western European democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. And so now the Nobel Peace Prize comes out of Oslo instead of the Viking terror destroying, the monasteries. So there are shadow formations that foreshadow, in our word in English, literally what will be coming. And we live in a post-nation state world. The rich, with their investments, have long ago abandoned the nation state. I mean, there were commands given, by Walmart that you have to lower your prices and move your factories away from America with trades unionism to China, or we will not carry your products. So Westinghouse air conditioners in Walmart are now made in China. I mean, that was a decision of management. It wasn't, saying, oh no, we need to hire the workers in America. They said, fuck the working class, we're going to, capital moves where it has to move. And so there's an evolution that's post-national. And so look at the working class like Detroit, a complete implosion, black hole of what was once in the 50s in the American moment, the symbol of the Oldsmobile convertible and the top-down 50s of California when I was living there then. Now that world is gone, and the working class have lost their bearings, they've lost their identity. You can't go to high school anymore and get a good job and have a track house and be viable with a high school education. You're completely trashed. So the working class is abandoned, and so what does it do? It comes up with these alternate connections. If you've ever surfed, as I do some insomniac nights, YouTube, you see all these cosmic mythologies of the Greys, the reptiles, the Arcturians, the Pleiadian Council, the Syrian Council. There's this whole extraterrestrial mythology operating like a great group mind, a coral reef, dreaming while it's awake and having all these astral plane visions. It's an utter fascinating phenomenology. You should check it out because you like media so much.
I hold provisionally that I might be not linearly but resonantly entwined with the subtle emanations of Arcturus,
Yeah.
But without any kind of scientific protocol for investigation, it's sort of, it's just, you put it on the altar and you let it sit.
Well, but there's also dimensionality. I mean, if you look at, say, in the 60s and 70s, Zachariah Sitchin came up with these theories that the Sumerian gods were extraterrestrials and they landed in rockets, and the maze that Inanna brought with the Arch of Civilization is the backpack in the Sumerian statue. And all of that technology he's projecting is 1950s science fiction rockets to the moon technology. It says more about us than about any extraterrestrials. If they're multidimensional creatures who are dealing with, complex forms of information, they're not going to arrive in tin cans and flying saucers.
Unless they feel like it.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think those tin cans say more about us and how we imagine what kind of technology they would have to have.
Right.
So we know the universe is billions and billions into the billionth power of stars and planets and the rest of it. So the idea is, even Nova has said that we're alone. Astrophysicists like Carl Sagan and Haiku, or whatever the guy's name, the Japanese guy who does Nova, they obviously think the universe is full of life, abundantly everywhere. And so the idea that there could be is a rational one. It's not irrational. But the idea that we interpret with our technology and limitations, no. So if you look at the mythology as a sociology of knowledge of the Arcturians and the Syrians and the Pleiadians, they have three distinct cultures that are operating on the YouTube coral reef. And so it's fascinating to sort of map it out and see what this means as a kind of descriptive process.
Mm-hmm. So, there's something in here, to backpedal just a moment, with respect to evil as the enunciation of the next level of order, the kind of cybernetic understanding of these major evolutionary transitions where a new individual emerges through the interplay of individuals as an adaptive response in an environment where a coordinated team is more flexible, adaptive, and responsive, and thus capable of managing a more complex environment. This is something that Robert Keegan's talked about in terms of individual developmental psychology and the shift between different kind of cognitive structures in the human mind, and something that Martin Noack's explored in mathematical biology at Princeton and Harvard. And then recently there was a paper that was published that's getting a lot of traction in artificial intelligence circles on the maximum causal entropic principle. And the gist of this paper is that that intelligence emerges as a primary function of entropy as a way of maximizing freedom in a chaotic system. So it kind of harkens back to this notion of the alchemical coincidentia oppositorum, and the sense in which it's not simply that evil itself is perspectival and like it's a horizon,
Yeah, sure.
And so there's this sense in which
bacteria and pollution love it.
Yeah. So connect that to fractal noia and this sort of rising autistoid disposition and mentality in the contemporary world. And I just read a paper last night on autist researchers describing a new theory for autism called the intense world syndrome. in which they basically argue that autism spectrum disorder is the adaptive response of a brain that is, the sensory system is overstimulated, and that it's an attempt to emphasize pattern recognition in order to make sense of the information overload. So in that sense, what they were saying basically is that in both human and rat studies, that these excitatory neural networks that would resemble the networks of the conspiracy theorists on YouTube, spontaneously resonating with one another, are accelerating and amplifying the process of learning. But it's a that, again, with the McLuhan thing, it's fear and intelligence going hand in hand. It's like a form of hyper-conditioning, and they can't really even be separated.
Well, there are two kinds of biological processes: bacterial, where you don't have distinct species, but you have a planetary bioplasm, and they're, not eukaryotic. And then there's packaged genes and individuation, where an individual dies and goes through a reproductive sexual process and is able to accelerate time and change. Those two processes have never gone away. They're still architectonic of human phenomenology. Let's take the collective individual thing. Entropy, I don't think is the right word, because naturally energy tends to dissipate and will just spread. So that's not in and of itself. But when bacterial formations compost ideas or paradigms and turn them into noise, and then creative people recognize in noise and chaos a new kind of pattern and come up with ideas from two disciplines and put them together, then that creative process has come because the old paradigm has been digested and broken down by this kind of bacterial one. Now, in the coincidence of opposites, when groups work together, and we know that when people come together in Austin or MIT, where I was, they get smarter all together. If you're working with geniuses, your IQ goes up along with everybody else's. If you're in Austin, there's one kind of culture. If you're in Odessa, Texas, there's another kind of culture. And people are dumber. I don't care what Wendell Berry says. And I've argued with him about this. They're dumber in Odessa than they are in Austin. And you live there, so you know that's true. So when the MIT theory was, get a bunch of geniuses together and give them the best graduate students you can, and then everybody just gets smarter. But that can consolidate and become a rigid church-like ecclesiastical elite. So Jim Lovelock, who did Gaia, who worked as a loner in it, he said, why should the scientist not live like a composer? So he lived in Cornwall and not at the Imperial College of Technology in London. And he said, you can tell the importance of a scientist by how long he holds up progress in his field. So someone like Einstein has this moment of genius, and then he locks into an interpretive thing that made him great and cannot make the shift to quantum mechanics, because he can't see how chaos and creativity and complexity is a much more generative process for the universe. He's trying to have a unified theory and make it all the same. So Einstein holds up progress. Cuvier held up progress in paleontology because he was the world's expert. And so you have to have this kind of center of brilliance like MIT, and then you have to have these rogue, wild West intellectuals who are off in the frontiers, who are not part of the system, who come up, and so Thomas Kuhn said, it's never the expert who comes up with a new paradigm. It's always somebody young or new to the field or somebody in a totally different field. So this is but when science began to get collective after World War II, and we created government funding for big science, and big science began to emerge, that's when we generated the image of the isolated, lonely genius, the Descartes, the Einstein. But that was all pop mythology. Science doesn't work that way. Look at Google. Or look at Apple, for example. Here's this whole myth of Steve Jobs, this individual who's single-handedly creating iPhones and all the rest of it. But Apple is this huge conglomerate, and it's not innovative. It's got these, sweatshop factories in China. It's not a liberal organization. That's all mythology. It's not the way how Apple works. Which, when you go back to your Google Glass thing, the difficulty with this corporate collective force versus this individual autistic one and genius one, since autism is a shadow of individuals who cannot read other people's minds. They've got Asperger's syndrome, and they're locked into a kind of hypertrophic, egoic function and just go into monologue. When you look at what they're doing, they provide you with a surrogate experience of the real thing so that you can never have the real thing. Now, let's take mystical experiences. If you look at shamanism, if you look at Descartes' dream, Kay Cooley's dream, you notice with creative people around, either in their adolescence or in the 32, 33 period, that they have a power vision of their life's work. Descartes is alone in his cabin in a cold, snowed-in winter in Bohemia, and he begins to have these unusual experiences and dreams, and single-handedly he begins to create what's going to become the scientific revolution. So one of the shamanic experiences that happen in adolescence is what Sri Aurobindo calls the psychic being, the sum of all your incarnations. This is not a Western notion, it's a reincarnational model. Is quite different from the ego, that is just the identity of one incarnation. The psychic being begins to project into time this ego, and at a certain point there's a reversal, and the ego begins to be aware of the daimon. To put it in video game terms, the ego is the video game of the daimon. There is a specific mystical, transformative, shamanic experience that classically creative people have, in which they have this figure ground reversal and they become aware of the daimon, and it begins to transform their life creatively. Now, this has provided you in a technological substitute that you're given Google Glass, and you now become a consumer of your life, and you become an actor, entertainer, and the displacement is now technologically focused. So you're photographing yourself, making love to your girlfriend, you're revisioning your experience and looking upon it the way the daimon would look upon the ego. You're unlikely to have the classical mystical ego daimon experience because it's being provided to you with a corporate substitute in either a video game or Google Glass. So you become a consumer of your own life, and you begin to be part of the consumptive society that you look for the hot, new next thing. It's Google Glass, and then it's, the iPhone, and then it's something else. There'll always be a new next thing you've just got to have.
Well, here's the thing that I've noticed, and we've talked a lot about, and I would like to talk at some point here about, subtler invasions into the energetic or the etheric membrane of a person, and the actual electronic risks that are being posed by these technologies. But in terms of it being a perceptual shift, something that I've noticed in terms of my own relationship with glass is that I have when I was carrying it around with me at Burning Man, I started to notice a perceptual shift in which I began to look through my own eyes as though I were someone else consuming the experience that I would record, and in that sense, I don't know that, it's probably because of the way that I'm primed psychologically as an individual, and the way that I have been, instructed to be mindful and observant of my own passing states of consciousness. And it may have indeed that exact effect that you just described on the majority of people, but something that I noticed was that I was thinking of it in terms of like these transitional provisional structures that like Jean Piaget talks about in development, where you go from a totally external sense of authority or security, your parents, and then it becomes something that's mediated by like a security blanket or a teddy bear before you're finally able to source it yourself internally. And similarly, I felt like in a weird way, this same issue of the enunciation of the next level of order was occurring here for me, in which the universal surveillance state was being this sloughed off environment within which I was experiencing that very daimonic figure ground reversal and looking into my own life as an observer. That I was taking this like security camera view in which I had a new angle on myself as, in terms of like Brian David Johnson at Microsoft and these other people who were talking about the digital simulacrum, and this issue of how when we look at, these people talking about the way that your cell phone knows you better than you know yourself, or these people that are looking at the quantified self and being able to take a sort of satellite surveillance view of your own life as these technologies become more and more available to the common person, and the way that is bringing a new level of personal understanding and inquiry. And I'm just like very lucky to be surrounded by people like the Buddhist Geeks community and Mindful Cyborgs podcast people, and these people that are trying to make sense of the way that these technologies are actually amplifying and accelerating this exact spiritual turn.
This is another rerun, and people have commented on the evolution of, Stuart Brand from Ken Kesey and the electric Kool-Aid acid test to becoming the capitalist of Wired magazine and the Silicon Valley before Google. And so in one generation, you have the psychedelic generation where Hoffman's LSD is providing here comes everybody with the mystical experience. But if I look at my generation that went for acid and then I chose not to, a lot of them became psychotic and never really amounted to a hill of beans. And I went the classical yogic way, because the basic trope of consciousness in the Western world goes back to the two birds in the Upanishads and the Rig Vedas, that there are two birds on the tree, meaning the spinal column and the brain. One tastes the fruit and one watches the other bird tasting the fruit. That's the root metaphor of consciousness. And so Vipassana is basically creating a witness consciousness where you watch the mind go through the hypnagogic state, the astral projection state, the auditory state, the samadhi absorption state, and there is less and less of an ego there, but there's still some vestigial witness consciousness that that this state of absorption is happening to you. Whereas autistic people, in Piaget's terms that you just mentioned, children when they're in the sandbox playing, at a certain age, they're in egocentric monologue, and they are not actually playing with others. They are just playing alongside. And they are like somebody with Asperger's syndrome that doesn't know how to read other minds and attune to them. And then the next level that comes up is team playing, coordination, sharing, making nice instead of just throwing a tantrum. So autism is a kind of cultural signal that perhaps for something like lead in the wine glasses of Rome contributing to its fall, we live in a saturated environment. And that's why I suggested reading The American Replacement of Nature. This big computer I have here and digital clocks all have magnetic fields. And I have a scanner from Real Goods where I can, test their intensity. We all live in places that really disturb our sleep cycles, that we don't really get down into deep, dreamless sleep. We're forever kind of swimming around in this hypnagogic. So if you're in this saturated environment and you're getting sleep deprived, then we know one of the characteristics of sleep deprivation is schizophrenia and dreaming while you're awake and hearing voices. And it doesn't have to do with your mother dropping you on your head when you were a kid. It has to do with, chemical imbalances and, living in a saturated environment of electro-smog and pollution. There are now people in Zurich who can be consultants for electrosmog, and they'll go through your apartment and register all the crap. And it may not be coming from you. Your neighbor underneath may have something, and he's microwaving you all night long while you sleep, So we don't know what the fuck is going on,
Well, it's like Ghostbusters. They're going through the apartment with the ghost meters. This is something that you discussed in, I think it was the final chapter of Coming Into Being, when you're talking about the Rig Veda and the descent, the thinning veil between the realm of the human and animal world and the spirit realm, and how what Eric Davis calls the electrical imaginary that's facilitated by this global communications network is opening the door through which these beings that inhabit that are palpable and consensual recognitions in this hypnagogic state of consciousness are re-entering the mundane society, and it's in a similar way. There's something really something really interesting in terms of to talk about, like, numerologically, the 888 and the 666, the Christ and the beast, and how, you've spoken in your Time Falling Bodies Take the Light series on archive.org about how, this was like a soul pairing, that they represent sort of the two forks on the tongue.
Or as the soul come down, it can't incarnate fully, so it splits.
Right.
Psyche and into the male and female, and then you go in a body looking for your other half, your psyche, or what Jung would call the anima. At a certain level, it gets reabsorbed in yogic, and your psyche begins to be not a dream anima figure in your unconscious life, but begins to be a wave function in your atmanic life at a higher level. So, I'm getting really esoteric here, but
that's good.
but you started it by talking about the etheric body, so I want to talk about the etheric.
Right. Well, right. I mean, I think and consequently, I think that there's a really interesting karmic twin event occurring here when you look at, for example, the way that this dangerous, volatile, and in many respects, both inspiring and misleading substance like LSD historically was not only responsible for burnout, but was also, like Ralph Abraham wrote about in the MAPS Bulletin, just how thoroughly it saturated cyberculture and was responsible for software revolution, personal computing.
It was way out there.
Yeah, and you've got people like Kary Mullis thanking LSD publicly for his Nobel Prize-winning discovery of the DNA polymerase chain reaction. You've got Steve Jobs thanking LSD for the iPhone. And there is this bizarre co-complementarity going on here. Recently, Rich Doyle, who's I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's an absolutely fascinating information scientist and rhetorician from Penn State. And he also teaches classes in science fiction, and he's doing an online seminar right now through Synccast on the mystical vision and exegesis of Philip K. Dick. And, and one of the things that he was talking about in their first call was about how, like as you mentioned earlier, that these revolutions tend to be colonized by this underlying power structure, and people like Jan Irvin, who came out recently in the last year, pointing to all of this enormous chain of evidence suggesting that the CIA was largely responsible for the psychedelic revolution and created the counterculture as a means to control the dialectic. Or it
got out of control, and they passed out LSD in the subways of Montreal without telling the Canadians what they were doing. And then as the product, through Hoffman and others, I've met Hoffman, it got into the pop culture, and then they took it over. It would be pretty hard for the CIA to control the human being and every single thing and Esalen and everything. But they may have definitely kicked it off. But it oftentimes gets beyond their control, and then they have to go into these new structures. Philip K. Dick, he was paranoid, but the 50s was precisely the time the CIA was bringing down Mossadegh and creating havoc in Nicaragua and around the world, and they had this system for how to bring down states and put up client states. And according to Peter Dale Scott, they were in the drug business in Cambodia, using the sale of heroin and opium and all these other things to support, so they didn't have to get any money from Congress and had their own global private economy. So Afghanistan and drugs is all about, according to Peter Dale Scott, all about the CIA's, drug trafficking.
All right, and so
what does Lyndon LaRouche say the Queen of England is in MI6? Drug traffickers.
Right.
So there's a paranoid, nut for you.
Well, so Rich Doyle, one of the things that he was getting at in that call was that that Phil Dick kind of modeled for us this fractalnoid attempt. That he was sort of the space monkey for this whole new way to organize our epistemology, and that it seems to him as though the technocratic colonialization of the visionary experience and this attempt by commercial culture to do things like in that essay I sent you, to create these psychedelic flowers of a Hyundai exploding from the screen, and to turn the Bacchanalia and Saturnalia into a commercial event, and this really tense dialectic between the people who recognize the liberating potential of an event like Burning Man, the transformational possibility that it holds, and also the fact that it's still standing in shit. And that it's still, in many ways, a large commercial corporate enterprise that is deeply in bed with.
Yeah, it looks like a psychedelic theme park from someone who's on the outside of it.
Right, but what he was saying was that this is also itself an example of this coincidence of opposites, because the technocratic colonialization of these experiences seems like it may actually be bringing us to the brink of that moment where the negative feedback mechanism kicks in, and it's actually breeding a sort of turn into the subjective, that the hyper-objective is, in order to like balance itself and create a complement, it's creating this, that you can't move in one direction without this this conservation of psychological momentum.
Prokaryotic and eukaryotic functions, that there are two different identity structures of how evolution and the planet and Gaia works with this bacterial film organizing life on the planet. But in this coincidence of opposites, the etheric body, to go back to what you brought up, is breaking down as the membrane of autonomy. Part of Francisco Varela's autopoietic theory is autopoiesis requires a kind of membrane closure, and where you start producing your own reproductive parts within yourself. And so the notion of identity and the individual is breaking down, and so there's this rise of autism, paranoia, the way in which Philip K. Dick, as a paranoid, is prophetic. His paranoia is not, well, he was a genius and he could write, but he was paranoid. No. This is integral to his vision. It's important. And so all of these things are going on because now the etheric body is expanding and transforming and changing, so that you have a new imaginary, to pick up the Lacanian word that you used, where my imaginary friends, for example, as a child playing in the noosphere, are not, the bear up there that my daughter gave me on the bookshelf, the koala bear. You see him behind me on the bookshelf?
I lean like it's going to help me see any better. Yeah, just bear. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yeah, okay. My daughter gave me that. My imaginary friends, invisible friends, are angels and jinn and stellar beings, talking about Arcturus, and that I can go into trance and in meditation experience these beings. Now, in terms of neuroscience, all I'm doing is dreaming while I'm awake. I'm in lucid dreaming. So I see a jinn, or I see an angel, or I see a being from Sirius, or whatever. This is not to be taken literally, according to a neuroscientist. This is just that I'm in the hypnagogic state. I'm watching it because I'm meditating. I'm not, taking acid. I don't need to take acid. I mean, I could, I got hypercalcemic once on just too much Tums, which changed the calcium balance, and all of a sudden I'm getting hypocalcemic delirium, and that was trippy. So my intuition was right, that I'm the last person, because I have the genes naturally. It's like American Indians who are shamanic, and you give them alcohol and they get completely screwed up, and they can't take alcohol. And so it's the same for, the Irish Druid genes. If you've got them, then boy, you don't need acid, and acid will just make you psychotic. So the etheric body of the individual and the collective and the planet, Gaia, are all in a process of destructuring and restructuring and reintegrating. And civilization is not the structure anymore. And so traditional religions, knowing that they're losing it, are going out in a blast of heat and violence. I mean, nothing is more violent than the Abrahamic religions. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, it's all the same thing. They're nuts.
Something that we touched on here that I think is a key distinction to be making is that in this research on the empathic deficit of the autistic neurotype.
The empathic, was that the word?
Yeah, the empathic deficit here.
You're beginning to break up.
Oh, is this?
Yeah, the screen is frozen.
Okay, can you still hear me?
I can hear you, but you're frozen.
All right, hopefully that will unfreeze in a second here. Let me know if it keeps up and we can restart the call.
The NSA was just probably recording it, and so
Oh, we're important. How?
There we go.
Yeah, that's that is the other thing about this, is that the way that it constellates around the anxious self. But one of the things that they talk about in autism research is the difference between cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Yeah.
And the problem with using an empathic deficit to diagnose autism turns out to be that the superb pattern recognition abilities of the autistic mind seem to lead to an underdeveloped cognitive empathy, an inability to generate an accurate theory of mind, but a hypertrophied affective empathy, in the sense that a lot of their social maladaptation is their hypersensitivity to the emotional states of other people and their inability to distinguish their emotions from their own, which again gets back to this whole electronic, tribal, resonant self that when we're starting to talk about the noetic polity as the new individual and the old individual as subsumed within this larger structure. So, and again, in that sense, you have ways in which the typical binary distinctions that we've been making about this stuff, and like you said about Phil Dick, it was his madness and his genius were one and the same, So, how is it that you suspect to kind of bring this down into a more concrete form here? Something that I really admire and that Mitch and I were just discussing was how, in a lot of ways, we look to you, we look to Phil Dick, and people like you as someone to whom we might be able to discern a precedent for how to manage this kind of information overload in a meaningful way, rather than simply, because there is. In autistic children, there does appear to be a critical period where you're able to create a less overwhelming environment that leads to less social difficulty later on, where they're less overwhelmed by other people. And so and it's kind of interesting to me that there's a there may be a moment, looking forward to digital natives, this term here, where people such as yourself still remember, you basically your major neural developments formed before this was really going to create any kind of major social issues. But at the same time, it just seems like there's a continuity here, a relatability.
Well, I think there is in the psychological profile of, say, let's take just three people: me, Joan Halifax, and Ralph Abraham. And Joan, of course, was the kind of psychedelic queen at Esalen and Stan Groff's wife, and did all kinds of heavy SDP and really heavy stuff in the 70s. And I never would allow her to be a Lindisfarne Fellow in the early days because she was basically into drugs. And my rules for Lindisfarne were: this is not Esalen, this is not Haight-Ashbury, this is Lindisfarne. If you want, drug ways to do it, then you go out to Esalen, and I wouldn't let people like Ira Einhorn in the door at Lindisfarne. He was the guy who got, arrested for chopping up his girlfriend and keeping her in a suitcase in Philadelphia. And he was a psychedelic con man for a lot of people during the 60s and 70s. And I talk about him in At the Edge of History in the Esalen chapter. And I smelled him out, very early on. So what the three of us had is we had an isolating event of a major illness that took us out of society in the Descartes fashion of Descartes isolated in his snowed-in cabin in Bohemia. And Joan had blindness, I had cancer, and Ralph had tuberculosis. And in that period of isolation, we went through this kind of inner transformative experience and reversal of identity, where identity is now no longer coming from institutions or coming from civilization. It's coming from another dimension opening up. It's a kind of what in books on shamanism is called the power vision. When you're an adolescent, you are taken out, you're recognized as a different kind of kid by another shaman, and you go off into the desert by yourself, and through very shamanic techniques that sometimes include drugs but don't have to. Sometimes it can be just sensory deprivation, like Muhammad in his cave. If you're in a cave, meditating for 36 hours or not sleeping, how could you not have a vision of the angel of Gabriel? I mean, it would be really weird if nothing happened to, Muhammad. So, blessed be he. So the phenomenon of sensory deprivation, going without sleep, in my case it was tuning to classical music and listening to Beethoven string quartets, and being isolated from society for, people for like 48-hour period. And then wham, a door opens and your cube becomes a tesseract. So individuals like Joan and Ralph and maybe Terrence McKenna, Ralph's friend, these people have gone through this kind of shamanic transformation on their own. And then when they returned to society, I had my year off between high school and college, in which I read War and Peace and Moby Dick and read a lot of the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, a lot of stuff, and listened to Beethoven string quartets. Then I went to Pomona College. And then I was in a regular, civilized, socializing institution, and I did very well. I, won a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to Cornell. But if I hadn't had that experience, and society had kept control of me, and I had a parent pushing me, and I didn't have a year off between high school and college, and I was crammed into a highly competitive school like Pomona, then I might have just crashed and burned out. So it's the old David Reisman distinction of inner-directed versus outer-directed. There has to come in the individuation process a reversal and going inward, discovering new dimensions in which the cube or the sphere becomes the hypersphere, the cube becomes the tesseract. And so when this happens to people like us, we're not getting it from LSD. I mean, Ralph, went on to, and Joan did, but I didn't, because my daimonic voice was saying, don't take drugs. Do it the classical yogic way. So I went into Kriya Yoga and did yoga. And learned how to watch my mind through yogic techniques instead of, acid or dope. So and even dope, I only smoked maybe 3 or 4 times in my life. It was very minimal when all my friends were, doing acid and drugs in the 60s. So
well, if you can get it, as Terence McKenna says, if you can get it on the natch,
Yeah, I remember when I was in the elevator with Terence, and I said, boy, Terence, do you know what they're going to do to you? And he was on his way to see his editor and agent at Doubleday. And I said, they want to market you. They need a new Timothy Leary. You're about to get packaged in ways you don't understand. He said, let it come. I want it. He really wanted fame and to be, a big shot.
But he died broke.
Yeah. Well, it's a fickle world. It was offered to me, and I said no, and refused to go on television, and so I'm dying broke too. So that's just the price you pay for doing it my way, a la Frank Sinatra. And but Terence had this glowing zealot's look in his eyes that he said, if you've never taken drugs, you're a fraud. You don't have anything to say to anybody. It's my way and everything else is wrong. And he was like a psychedelic fundamentalist. And so I would never have him as a Lindisfarne fellow. But I would have Joan and Ralph, who are Lindisfarne fellows, who are, and even Varela went through, and so did Gregory in the early days. I think Gregory took acid with dolphins or something, and did something really trippy in Hawaii.
The irony... go ahead. The irony of this whole situation is that part of Jan Irvin's disclosure about the underbelly of the psychedelic counterculture was that for the last 10 years or so of his life, Terence McKenna did not actually indulge in that heroic psychedelic dose that he proselytized. He hit a wall with it where he basically bumped up against the mysterium tremendum and was terrified to go back. And I think that there's a lesson in that with respect to the cultivation of the etheric body and its ability to adequately navigate these transpersonal domains.
So what I discovered in my own shamanic process of having an 11-hour operation for cancer of the thyroid, which comes from the poisoning of the environment from the open-air atom test in Southern California and Las Vegas. And that's why people are paranoid. There's this poison environment nobody's talking about, and the government is lying, and meanwhile, people are getting cancer. So I went through this shamanic process, and then over the years, as it intensified and the relationship developed, and I cultivated it by going to India and talking to the, or having darshan with the mother and meeting lots of yogis and the Dalai Lama and Sufis and setting up Lindisfarne on quitting MIT and separating from the mainstream big-time academic world to do the alternative thing with Lindisfarne. Then the entelechy developed, and the entelechy is like a Portuguese man of war. Do you know this biological marine animal that's a colony? It's not an individual.
Right.
And so at a certain point, I become sensitive that I'm a colony, that there is, that each of the subtle bodies, to go back to your etheric body thing, is a template for contact with a dimension. So that in the etheric body, which is very close to the physical body, the contact is with what the Muslims call the jinn. beings created out of fire. These are, in Celtic animism, these would be called elementals or spirits of nature. And the shaman, as he develops that relationship, often doesn't go any farther and uses them to change weather, to bring rain and stuff like that. That Hermann Hesse talks about in Magister Ludi at the last end of the story, where there's one about a shaman rainmaker. And then the astral body has this image of a stellar being. That is like your Arcturan or Sirian or Pleiadian, that there's this whole extraterrestrial dimension that comes into play in the new imaginal, the new imaginary. And then at the higher levels of the mental body, there is the angelic realm, which are, I think, better called in Neoplatonism the celestial intelligences. That these are beings who are made up out of music and mathematics, which you're a musician. And they're not made out of meat. And we know from string theory the universe is supposed to be made out of music. So it's natural that we would encounter cognitive beings who are made out of music, not made out of meat. So each of the subtle bodies creates this kind of star configuration like Da Vinci's man, in which those beings become part of your ecology of consciousness and your ecology of being. And so this is the positive dimension of working with the dissolution of the breakdown of the membranes. And so if that happens, I don't have a crisis of identity, of feeling depressed or, like the psychotic breakdown of individuals who go into school shootings or public places and are completely psychotically dysfunctional. So if you've gone through the transformative process, then you don't have to take your identity from individuals. But then what becomes the difficulty is, how do you deal with all the autodidacts who declare themselves to be undiscovered geniuses? I won't mention any names, but I could. There are people out there who will publish their own books and have 5,000 pages of what is their cosmic rant. They don't do any of the heavy lifting of real science or real philosophy. But they are people who just have money and can support their own rants. And so the socialization process, how do you interface with society if you've gone through this transformative experience? Mm-hmm. Now, luckily for me, I had an Ivy League PhD. I was promoted every year. I was at MIT. And I could talk sensibly to foundation officers or Rockefellers. And so I was able to fundraise Lindisfarne, and I wasn't a loony, who was just leading a cult. And I had enough good sense not to make Lindisfarne a cult about me, but to bring in creative people who were my equals, not my disciples. So there was Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder, Jim Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, Francisco Varela. There were about 32 of us in this collegium of the Lindisfarne Fellows. Now, that's just a lucky break that I had that skill and didn't become psychotic or didn't develop a cult, and made Lindisfarne more open so that people like Joan and Ralph liked it and liked hanging out. If somebody else, like Argüelles, he imploded. Did you ever meet Jose Argüelles?
No, I didn't, but I've been keeping tabs on that. It was the day that I created a video feedback loop where I was streaming video from Google Glass while performing a concert on stage this summer, and we were projecting it back on the stage so the audience could see themselves on stage with me. Happened to be just synchronistically Carl Jung's birthday, Aldous Huxley's birthday, and the day that was the day after the end of Argüelles' Dreamspell calendar. So it was like the first day of the new world, and it was incidentally something that Mitch said that I really ought to mention to you in terms of how it is that we sustainably and responsibly navigate this dissolution of the membrane and this endosymbiotic enfoldment into the entelechy. The day of that concert, following the last conversation that we had about the ensoulment of sacred swords and instruments, I I ceremonially ensouled my Google Glass.
Okay.
And from that moment forward, I had a very unusual experience when I went to pick it up in New York and I was hanging out with Mitch, where the week before I picked up my glass, I noticed a bump behind my ear. And this is a bump that would be exactly where the bone conduction audio plate for the glass sits up against the head. And I began to wonder if this were not an anxiety-induced, anticipatory, psychosomatic bacterial infection operating under, in my paradigm, I think there's a fairly solid likelihood that cancer is something that occurs due to an intracellular microbial infection. And so after ensoling the glass, I wore it for a full hour in full powered mode, streaming video to to space and back, and did not experience any of the detrimental physical effects, the discomfort or the numbness that I had been experiencing before that moment. That I wore it for, up to that point, I'd been wearing it for like a couple minutes at a time and really uncomfortable with it. But after that moment, I wasn't experiencing any trouble, and it really felt like it was energetically aligned with me. Then at Burning Man, the plot thickened because it's a very weak construction. This thing, there's almost nothing there. There's a titanium band that goes all the way around, but right here where it connects to the antenna and the audio plate, there's nothing holding it. There's nothing supporting that joint there, and it snapped while I was carrying it around in my backpack. I sent it in for a warranted repair or a replacement, and when I consulted, I was really, because this is the device that I had established a personal relationship with, I was hesitant to actually do this. And I consulted the I Ching online about this. Should I go ahead and make this trade? And the I Ching's response was the image of, a generally positive and beneficial turn, but one in which I was leaving a door open and I had to be careful to monitor that door lest anything unsavory slip through. That it was basically saying, you're going to have to treat this one the same way you treated the last one, and establish a new personal relationship with this. Don't forget that this thing has, is standing. I mean, those things are, the glass is manufactured by Foxconn. It's created in a suicide factory. It has a very unsavory origin in the material realm.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm glad that you brought up insofar as the materiality of these devices, in our relationship to the elemental aspects of them, is where do you stand in terms of the fact that this entire electronic infrastructure is reliant upon the mining of rare earth minerals and this rather rapey relationship to the natural world,
Well, it's certainly no different than, our dragging out Mother Earth to make clay in the Neolithic, or slaughtering the forests in Gilgamesh, killing the spirit of the forest to have wood in our ships and all of that. So we've been at this destructive relationship in the same way that bacteria can digest all kinds of things, and they don't stop, and we're not likely to be able to govern industrial civilization to stop. The pollution is increasing from Fukushima to you name it. So it's just basic to human culture. What I think is evolving after the catastrophe, and I think catastrophes are part of the restructuring, the same way galaxies will collide. Andromeda is headed our way. Now, the paranoid thing is to say that's a collision. Well, another positive way is to say it's a copulation. And, it's going to be occurring in slow time. So who knows what that's going to be like when two galaxies merge and swirl apart and do all kinds of things.
Hot.
And we know that around black holes, there is an event horizon of dark energy that's compressing the black hole, which may be transferring star material into another parallel universe. I mean, it's a big, complicated universe out there. So we're in the process of the catastrophic breakdown of industrial civilization. It's politics, it's individuality, it's value systems, it's religions, where what it's going to be at the other end, I don't know, but it seems to me there will be a new etheric body for the individual and a new kind of etheric body for the Earth, which may be part of our paranoid metaphors that the Earth's magnetic field is going to reverse, that whole, December 21st, 2012 thing. Mm-hmm. And so it may be that in the future, as I said, I think in Replacement of Nature, that rather than ensouling sacred mountains the way the Hopi do, we will ensoul, computers or machines, and that the Ray Kurzweils, rather than being the nutcases they are just like Philip K. Dick, are prophetically picking up on something but suffering from misplaced concreteness by saying in 2020 biology will be over and we'll download the soul into a computer. That's just bullshit.
Right. Well, a couple years ago I went through that sort of figure ground reversal with respect to the Cartesian paradigm of the ghost in the machine, and it flipped for me. And if you look at the anxiety of the invasion, the penetration of the human body by machines, that's become such a pronounced image in like the films of David Cronenberg, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Then what you have is actually it's the machine in the ghost, and that we're not so much going to be uploading ourselves into computers as uploading computers into ourselves, which is demonstrated by recent research in which they were able to herd sperm cells into carbon nanotubules, or I guess iron filament nanotubules, and then induce magnetic fields so that these sperm were driving little magnetic robots to deliver medicine throughout the body. It's a hybrid organism, but the machine is in us, and it takes on that what you've discussed as that spiraling hypertorus, where it's like, which one is which? Am I in the room or is the room in me? But I feel like this is actually it's creating a more egalitarian or a lay understanding of these esoteric concepts as they become more and more concrete and exoteric. So as terrifying as it is, it seems like the terror is.
In the Gnostic mythology of 2,000 years ago, the soul must be a being of light that was entrapped in matter, and so that we are hybrid animals to begin with as spiritual beings. And so in yoga, in Vedanta, they teach the world is Maya, and you have to withdraw consciousness from the senses in pratyahara, to use the Sanskrit phrase, and then you achieve pure consciousness that's not basically sensory Maya or delusions. So we have this hybridization in our religious mythologies going back thousands of years.
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking more concretely and practically to these issues, in terms of how it is that we can establish a practice in which the living economic, political, technological, exoteric reality of the situation and the conceptual framework of the spiritual traditions that we've inhabited are superimposed on one another. How is it? I mean, you've spoken very, very eloquently about this penetration and this invasion and the compromise that we're making as human beings. But I mean, is this something that you personally feel is more of McLuhan talked about how it was his revulsion for the new that gave him the fascination. Yeah, I mean, is this something that you feel will be, is more of like a personal distaste or revulsion for this, or is this something that you recognize a real subtle distinction, and there is a difference between the kind of organic machine symbiosis that you've envisioned and spoken about, and what you're seeing actually unfold in the world right now with glass and stuff like this?
I would go back to McLuhan's laws of media, where every new medium obsolesces the previous medium, and in cultural retrieval retrieves the previously obsolesced medium. So electronics obsolesces print, but culturally retrieves animism. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of the video games, it was very mythopoeic of, Amazons and demons, and all the mythology of video games were really quite archaic, like Tolkien's world. So I think I would be more inclined toward the Madhyamika, the middle path, that obviously I'm talking to you with this Big Mac on my desk. I use email. I'm not a Luddite like, say, Wendell won't have a computer. And he gets morally superior. And when The Economist, who uses computers, Brian Arthur, tried to reach out and talk to him at the Fellows Conference, he wouldn't have any part of it, because from his point of view, Brian Arthur was fallen because he was from Stanford Park and used computers. And Wendell gets angry at me a lot of times because I challenge his moral position. He's used to inhabiting the moral high ground of looking down at everybody and returning to nature. And I'll challenge him, and I said, your nature is a 19th century fabrication that's based on women and animals in their place and a cancer crop tobacco with government subsidies. Your 19th century Kentucky is toxic. And he doesn't want to hear that, and so he still is very pissed off at me. So I think the ability of Lindisfarne to speak across many cultures has ended. I think effectively Lindisfarne's zeitgeist is over. It's 1972 to 2012, pumped, end of conversation. And so now, rather than having it dribble on and become ridiculous, I've just pulled the plug on it and said, no, Lindisfarne is cultural history. It's, it had its run of 2 generations. That's enough. So I traveled the middle path. I have a titanium valve in my heart. I've had high-tech surgery twice, with 2 open heart surgeries, and then cancer as a kid. So, but I'm also, with skillful means, and I'm not just going to adopt everything. And so that's why when you adopted Google Glass, I said, hey, Michael, is this going to give you epilepsy and interfere with neuronal synchrony? Is this like the X-ray machines in shoe stores when I was a kid of Tom McCann that were, toxic and they had to get rid of them? Is this like radium makeup for women to make their faces whiter and give them radium powder? You've seen that on the web, I'm sure. Uh-huh. So I won't adopt everything. And I sort of, it's like Polonius. Be not the first by whom the new is tried, nor the last by whom the old is set aside. How classic can you get? Old fart Polonius giving his little, truisms that are not Shakespeare, they're Polonius in Hamlet. So, but that's pretty much how I am. I'm not the jump in with Google Glass yet. I immediately have a warning that goes up and said this may interfere with, with the brain and neuronal synchrony. Mm-hmm. If a surrogate comes up to try to replace my direct relationships with the entelechy of the hyperdimensionality of consciousness and a different ecology of consciousness, then I protect its integrity by saying no, the same way I said no to becoming a celebrity. I mean, I had all that stuff offered to me when I was, in the 70s, and I said, just as I said no to big-time academia and quit the university, I said no to television and becoming a celebrity. And that's why I was warning Terrence, and he said, I want it, let it come on.
Well, I think... Go ahead.
I'll end the sentence. I watched Bucky Fuller and Alan Watts, being destroyed by the media, and even Marshall, who should have known better. And I said, I'm not going to let them do that to me. I'm going to be much more invisible. But that means your books don't sell. You won't go into a bookstore in Austin and find my books. You have to special order them.
That may be true. I don't know. The means have changed, But I think that at least in the case of Terence McKenna, knowing a lot of people who were his personal friends, I know that he was very much like you said. It seemed like he had the vision, but he never had that figure ground reversal. And he was. In the sense that, the ideas we have us, really profoundly animated by the ideological need to disseminate this knowledge. It wasn't so much, I don't think, as it is with many people, an egoic drive for fame, so much as it was a sense of service to the mushroom and its teachings, and the sense that he was never able to flip it around and recognize himself as, the concert of all of these ecological vectors.
And I think each of these drugs has its own shadow formation, whether it's grass or it's acid or it's ayahuasca. I've met, I tend to think ayahuasca is very toxic. The people I've met, it's been very destructive. And they're either sick or died in some cases of cancer, or they're just delusional. So I think one has to be really careful what kind of interior pharmacology you introduce into your body.
Just as a matter of full disclosure, because we are having a conversation about the distinction between privacy and secrecy, and the reconfigured nature of the self in an age of universal transparency, or at least the appearance of it. Just about 6 months before our first conversation, I was down in Peru participating in an ayahuasca ceremony with a group that was, there's a whole cultural ecology down there. There's no two tribes that have ever really engaged it in the same way. And this particular lineage, the Chavin, look at it as an ordeal poison, and
what kind of poison?
An ordeal poison. That they were looking at it as an initiatory experience rather than a healing experience.
Okay.
And in the two ceremonies that I participated in which rather than sitting in the more like familiar and recognizable song circle, where it's led by a shaman who's singing Icaros and guiding the experience for a group, so that they can kind of unify into this, what you might talk about as sort of the flagella around this angelic body that they're creating for the night. We were all separated and sent into our own cabins and left to undergo this on our own. And I was subject to the most profound, difficult, terrifying, intolerable apocalyptic visions that I have ever experienced. And it really profoundly animated my own epicalist assertions. It really, I came out of that experience convinced that in 18 months we were going to go through this pole shift, and that, that there was going to be this global reversal in which the waking life and the dreaming life completely inverted, and that the world that we know today would be as incomprehensible as a dream, vanishing in the vapor of the morning dew. It's like I came back a proselyte, and it took me 2 years to get over it, to recognize that, as you said before, sometimes you're cutting a switchback up a mountain and you can see the temple at the top of the mountain, and that it's up there, but it looks really close and you still have miles to go.
Yeah, that's right.
And so
SDP and ketamine and all of them have their different toxic side effects.
I think, just insofar as like, kind of returning to the trunk of this conversational tree, one of the just reliable toxic symptoms of both schizoidal and autistic spectrum stuff is this sort of prophetic thing, this this psychic inflation, which I see just totally rampant in psychedelic counterculture, where everyone is completely convinced of their awakening, you know. And I talked to people. I spoke to a neurological researcher, Jeffrey Martin, at Burning Man this year for a good 2 hours. He's the first person that's ever really done thorough research into the neurophysiology of enlightenment. You know, insofar as people who are recognized by their communities as having no ego, you know, as having transcended the ego. And what he found was that, in fact, when you do, you know, PET scans of these people's brains, that those brain regions are shut off, and that whatever state of cognitive development they were when they had their awakening, that's locked into place. And those people are incapable of learning or adapting or changing at all after that moment.
Wow. No, that's interesting. Yeah, Richie Davidson from Madison, Wisconsin also does research in PET scans, CAT scans, and tomography on Tibetan monks. So his whole lab is looking into this. He's part of the Dalai Lama's Mind Life conference group, and works with Joan Halifax and my son on all this stuff. Yeah, I've seen that in I would call them like the old phrase idiot savants, that when you see people like Richard Baker Roshi, who got thrown out of San Francisco for kind of inflated behavior of feeling that if any woman was there, he was entitled to her. If there was anything he wanted, whether an art object or a BMW, he was entitled to it. And he was cosmically kind of inflated and felt he was an enlightened being. And he never could finish a book. He would just read the first chapter and underline. And he had all kinds of weird behaviors. And so it would correspond to what you're describing.
Right. He said,
I think Joan Halifax avoids it because she's very into compassion, and you know, she does meditation in prisons and works with dying people, and so compassion for her is a very hands-on, no bullshit kind of practice.
Right. That was something that Jeffrey Martin said was sort of it lended him some historical understanding with respect to why it is that these various communities, for example, the evolutionary memetics, the reason that something like the Bodhisattva's vow took root, and that we end up with this move from Theravada to Mahayana Buddhism, because they realize that the more people get locked into this consciousness within which everything is perfect, the less responsible they feel for social participation. And that the Bodhisattva's vow emerged as sort of a cultural adhesive to keep people from going off the deep end spiritually, and just losing themselves in this attempt to transcend the wheel of suffering. It's something and something similar I feel is going on here now with respect to what Robert Anson Wilson called reality tunnels, and how everything is splintering apart into this stained glass mirror of a million different epistemologies. It's very it is disconcerting, but at the same time, what can we really do other than put a...
Well, that often happens in a cultural civilizational shift, like all the cults at the time Christianity was emerging that were even more popular than Christianity, or in the period of medieval heresies, that preceded the Renaissance, and the Inquisition tried to rise up and stamp them out, but wasn't able, to do it, though they certainly held progress back for quite a while. But then eventually the Italian Renaissance and the medium became not religion as much as art and science as new cognitive cultural formations that would carry the new energy. And so I think now we've had, centuries of industrial civilization and the manipulation of nature. Obviously, there's no such thing as nature. As I said, nature is the horizon of culture. It's constantly changing. But we've reached the limits of that because we're contributing to our own extinction and to a massive dieback. And so even scientists who are not, psychedelic apocalyptic people will talk about the coming dieback of just the numbers of human beings, we're like a bacterial bloom that's about to bust. And so when we're in this kind of shift, then one of these heresies is going to be, one or two are going to be selected as more appropriate to this emerging post-industrial paradigm. And I don't mean post-industrial in terms of toxic electronic Apple computer. I mean literally post-materialistic. And it's too soon to tell. I, of course, from my own experience, think that the evolution of individuality through the entelechy is exactly what's happening, and that this formation is not just unique to me, but is happening to, other people, even though I'm the first person that I know of to formulate it in the terminology of the entelechy and put together, this cosmology in this particular way. But I'm sure there are other people doing similar things. You may have known them. How did you meet Mitch, by the way?
We were actually slated to speak together on a panel discussion at Burning Man in 2009.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
so we sat in on a talk about transformations in culture and about the role of these island social ecologies like Burning Man as sort of these the social equivalent of these shamans in a cave, or the Galapagos Islands, where you have these opportunities for really rapid evolution to get like skunk worked, and then whatever works on the island trickles back to the mainland of the society. And so looking in terms of the role of the temporary, what Hakim Bey called the temporary autonomous zone.
He's a weird dude.
Yeah. But very articulate and visionary. And I think the whole his whole notion of as I'm sure you've talked about with Mitch, this your book Insurrection of the Imagination has this incredible parallel to his notion that that there is no utopia, no stable utopia on the horizon, and that what's actually happening is that we're creating these little blossoming fringe groups, that explode and their spores pollinate the culture at large.
They become performances of time. It's like I've often said that Lindisfarne was not an institution; it was a concert of ideas. And so it lasted a little longer than a Woodstock phenomenon, but it was very much a coming together of ideas and people and, economics with, Fritz Schumacher and astronauts like Rusty Schweikert and chemists and Sufis and yogis and, all those people in the mix. That was a novel mix for the time, and it had its effect on spinning off things like Mind Life Conference and Sacred Architecture and all kinds of things that were sort of first talked about at Lindisfarne in the 70s, and then other people, took parts of it and ran with it. But it's over. It's not meant to be like Harvard or Princeton and go on for century after century. And some of the utopian communities in the 19th century, like the Shakers and Amana, tried to last. And generally, in the routinization of charisma, by the third generation, they've lost the vision.
Do you something that not to drop it there, but something that I found kind of interesting in terms of your mention about your concern that technologies like glass may induce epileptic seizures, was that in doing my research on this intense world syndrome model for autism, their experimental method involved using lab rats whose autism was induced by during their embryonic development, because one of the things that they found was that there's a particular epileptic prescription called valproic acid, or VPA, that leads to that if a mother is taking it when she's pregnant, it leads to about a 10% autism rate in offspring. And they were noticing that there's something about this medicine for epileptic seizures specifically that's attempting to that's adjusting the firing rates and the synchrony of these excitatory networks in the brain that's actually creating the autistic brain. So in a strange way, it's like it's like you may have been more right than you know, in the sense that even if I went ahead and I did all the research into what little is currently known about the amplitude of the electromagnetic frequencies coming off of this particular device. And for the most part, it's very intermittent and very weak. It's like very sharp, pronounced, high amplitude, but very short bursts. So you have, over time, it's actually a much less dangerous device than, say, a cellular phone. But nonetheless, there is.
But it's the cumulative effect, because there's arguments that low-level radiation is toxic, even though it's low level, and that there's cumulative. If you have, you're talking on the cellular phone right up against your brain all the time. I never do that.
Right. And
I use my cell phone as little as possible and refuse to get a smartphone. So one has to, know when to say no to idolatrous new technology that people are hyping without any research into what its side effects, can be.
Right. Something specifically that came out of this, in terms of, it's sort of archetypal placement in our culture, is that, in terms of what you were talking about, the two birds, and the one that watches the other bird. I noticed that part of my perceptual reconfiguration with it, in terms of not only looking at what I'm looking at, but looking at what I'm looking at as someone else looking at what I'm looking at, became that if I want to be recording something, I have to be looking right at it, because like an owl, the camera itself doesn't track my eyes. It's not following, so I actually have to turn my head and look at that.
Yeah, the next generation, they'll fix that, and
right.
Whatever retina goes to, it'll go with.
But for the time being, it has this really, for me, an evocative parallel with respect to the owl familiar of Athena. That there's this point in the the Kabbalistic energy body that it's like it's the little, is it the angel or the devil sitting on your shoulder? And it's here, and at the same time, it is also, as these myths continue to play themselves out in history over and over and over again, I'm not the only person that's noticed the potential that this is the so-called mark of the beast. So you get back into that, the double-edged sword of this, the angelic and demonic expressions of this one device whose potential as a weapon or as an artistic implement depends entirely on its epigenetic expression within the culture at large, and the way that it's being used or exapted by people. It's like.
Well, every new technology, as McLuhan said, is an amputation. It's an extension of man and an amputation. If you have a car, you don't walk to work. And Socrates, through Plato, said that books were bad because they would destroy our memory. And so in Bardic culture, Homer could recite the whole Iliad from memory, making it up also with riffs as he goes along. And now our educated class cannot even speak in complete paragraphs. If you look at 19th century parliamentary speeches, those people read the classics, they studied Latin syntax, and they got up and they spoke in complete syntactically correct paragraphs. Our leaders can't even manage a sentence,
LOL.
Both bushes would get tangled up in one sentence.
So something, though, again, with respect to the dialectic and the return here, is that as these cycles are accelerating, it becomes more obvious how, again, like movement in one direction creates movement in the opposite, and how the car by creating this, by enabling a suburban organization and creating this society in which AT&T says, demonically, reach out and touch someone. We're connecting you through the ethereal plenum here. It became necessary in the same way that it became that the ship allowed for the colonialization of the New World, and ultimately led to the laying of that telegraph cable, across the Atlantic. The car led to this electromagnetic grid in which we now are finding these post-industrial hyper-urban experiments where people are abandoning the car again.
Well, I don't own a car. I live in small cities, and so in places like either Manhattan or Cambridge or here in Portland, my upaya skillful means of being an intellectual is I don't own a car, I don't own a house. I live in a yogi's electronic cave because I have this big, Mac that was given to me on my desk here, and I can Skype and Google Hangout. But for the most part, I can go a week or two without talking to a live human person because I don't know a soul in Portland because I never lived or grew up here or taught here. At MIT, at least I taught at MIT, at Cambridge. But they're all dead and gone. No one is there from the time that I was at MIT. Chomsky's still alive, but he's about the only one. And and I think he's finally retired. So I live a radical life in the sense that it's really rooted, but it's not what everybody else is living. I'm not in the suburbs. I'm not in, a corporation. I'm not in an academic community. And that kind of intellectual style is quite rare.
Do you find that, it seems to me almost again as if you're sort of just slightly ahead of the curve, and that this is what we're going to get is this, in the same sense that we had this whole, bioplasm of free-floating, relatively like loosely intermixing bacteria, and then you create a multicellular organism where the cells are like gridded together in bone and muscle, and they retain their place with this circulatory network of specialized cells. That what we're looking at now, and you spoke about this in your work on the circus in Charles Dickens, that there is a transient culture that that existed before and will exist after the industrial world, and that here I am, and just as you are, not terribly aware of too many, not too well connected to too many people in Austin, Texas. I spend most of my day, gridded into the bonework of my apartment building, but then when I do kind of break off into the blood flow, then I become this member of this rather nomadic global population in a resurgence.
Well, and you have your music and your concerts as another form of, performance art.
Yeah, so it just seems like you are actually a sort of an example here of the organization that people are going to be taking in a civilization when the car as a transitional structure, like the security blanket, has vaporized into this network of ethereal communication.
Yeah. Yeah, even though I grew up with the age of the automobile and grew up in LA when they were building the freeways and had a car when I was in high school, and so I know that culture, but chose after living in places like Paris or Manhattan that it's Kenneth Boulding, the economist, prophesied in the 60s, in the future the rich will walk and the poor will drive, and that's how it is now with immigrant workers and used cars. So I choose not to live that way and live very simply, but I do find that this electronic means of communication, because one son is in Chester, England, the other is in Vancouver, my wife is in Zurich, so even my nuclear family, my daughters in Brunswick, Maine, are spread out. We're not living a nuclear family, kind of traditional monogamous life. And so both, as my wife now is in an ashram in India for 3 months for the winter. So that's a kind of different lifestyle than most people would want.
But it seems to be the one that they're getting.
Fall here with me for a New England fall, so it's a different kind of way. It's like coming together for gigs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing that that Rushkoff explored in Present Shock, is the way that we had these ethnic, clearly goal-oriented tribal contests in team sports, and how that has vaporized and become the improvised, spontaneous relationship of like a skateboarder or a skier to a personal contest, a relationship with the landscape, and there aren't clear goals anymore, and it isn't about tribal competition, even as that becomes amplified.
No, I think that's a good point about the shift from, because sports were always war in peacetime, and so they were to teach manly values and aggression and testosterone, and they still are that way in the NFL and football, but we've begun to see that the presidential election is just another version of the Super Bowl, the same two teams that are structurally the same, but just different colors. And I got suckered into believing Obama was a liberal African American, and didn't realize he was the avatar of Cheney, and I got totally snookered and taken by the corporate system. And now they'll probably come up with Hillary as the first woman president, and she's a complete corporate yes man. So nothing will change. So,
right.
So a lot of people unplugged from that collective culture.
And that seems to me to be sort of almost to tie a bow on it. That almost as much as anything seems to characterize what you were saying about your family, and what we're talking about in terms of the etherealization of competition itself in this movement towards extreme sports. That it is it's a phase change, like the movement from a liquid to a gas. And that.
Yeah, and I've written also about the etherealization in Wild River Review of Capitalism with the emergence of phenomena like bitcoins, which is clearly a transitional phenomenon. But now people realize that bitcoins has shown that there is a niche, there is a need there, and some other more successful version of it, than one that requires mining on a highly complicated computer, is going to replace it. And probably now J. Morgan Stanley is looking how to do it, how corporations can replace nation-state currencies, because nation-state currencies can't run the planet,
Yeah.
So
my friend from
the etherealization of capitalism.
Yeah, my friend from Amsterdam, Dadara, is Daniel Rosenberg. He's a performance artist, and he's been examining through his work he's been deconstructing the idea of the social consent of currency. And one of the things that he did this year at Burning Man was he created an enormous pyramid, on top of which was a giant Facebook like thumb. And he had this group of people that led this Baroque ritual, honoring the like, and just pointing out the emptiness of this utterly insubstantial social currency, and like when Doug Rushkoff was on Joe Rogan's podcast, one of the things that he talked about was how Facebook had the opportunity to destroy the Federal Reserve if they had figured a way to turn the like into a form of micropayment. And Jaron Lanier said the same thing. In his work, Who Owns the Future, he said we need to come up with a way to use social currency to fund micro royalty payments to enable a creative class in a world that has no jobs anymore. Everything's been automated.
Yeah, that's exactly the conclusion to my Lindisfarne memoir on the economic significance of Lindisfarne. What do you do in a culture when there are no jobs anymore, and identity is not based on I am what I own or I am what I do. And this whole shift, this etherealization that's occurring on all levels, the etherealization of marriage. I mean, it can take many different forms, from, gay marriage. The trouble with that is they're imitating the old conservative structures of the military, sports, and monogamous suburban marriage, and rather than the gays pioneering, they're bringing up, the rear, and they become, reactionaries. But you're seeing etherealization in polyamorous relationships or monogamous, committed, faithful ones, but that aren't, living in the same suburban tract house anymore. So all of those things are going on all at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that makes it extremely unpredictable, because the initial conditions effect of a fractal landscape of a chaotic system means it's inherently unpredictable how it's going to go back, how it'll evolve, interacting with catastrophes, diebacks, and emergent phenomenon that are coming up that are, angelic and novel and not demonic.
Yeah. I guess there was a quote of yours that I felt that there are actually three quotes of yours that came out of your talk on Exodus as revolution.
Oh, you're going back to all those talks. Yeah. Thanks to Jody Evans and Code Pink, she's put them all on the line.
They're excellent. I mean, that whole series, I binged on it while I was driving from festival to festival this summer, and it really deeply informed the talks that I ended up giving to people, in an attempt to explain the complementarity of these, seemingly divergent, dyads.
What you should know, by the way, since you can't get from the audio, is I'm like you. I'm a performance artist. I'm riffing and doing that stuff spontaneously in interacting, looking at the audience and talking to them, and not giving an academic lecture or reading. So in that sense, I had to create a new genre when I started lecturing for the first time, become a stand-up intellectual.
Right.
And I had been seeing these old 19th century forms where the professor paced back and forth and looked at his toes and never looked at the audience. And I discovered that if I make a sound like music, it echoes on the astral body of the audience, and a echolocation like a bat comes back at me and gives me the tuning fork tone of the audience's collective astral body. And then I begin to interact with that as I'm lecturing. And I remember once I did this at a large audience of a couple thousand people at Notre Dame University for a young conference. And this guy came up afterwards and said, "You're Hitler! You're Hitler!" I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Anybody who can do that with an audience is Hitler." And I said, "You mean if you could do that with an audience, you would be Hitler?" It's all this time, and I'm perfectly safe. And the same thing happened to me in Europe, where a German woman came up afterwards, and I was doing a riff to the faculty of the Swiss Institute of Federal Technology, a group of their faculty scientists in a meeting in Italy. And she said, "You're Hitler because you talk about mysticism, you talk about religion, you talk about science, you go in and out of these disciplines. This is crazy, you're Hitler." And the Swiss novelist, the famous writer named Adolf Musch, held up his hand and said, "Let me take care of her." And then he started defending me to this crazy academic German woman who thought I was Hitler. So very few people have discovered, and Terence had a quality of this because he was Irish. It must be a gift of the gab Blarney thing. I went to one of his raps at the Open Center in Soho, New York, and he was a very charming Irishman and had the gift of the gab. But the creation of a cognitive noetic polity to turn information into Wissenskunst and to make the talk into a work of art that's not an academic lecture, it creates two things. You get a lot of interest from people and effective resonance. And then academics will get really anxious and disturbed and said, "Well, when you talk about what I know from my doctoral dissertation, I know you're skinning on thin ice, and that makes me think that everything you're talking about is the same, And I had an engineer freak out at a conference at Lindisfarne, and he just rationally just wanted to control, and he wanted to have everything in notes and order, and he had an engineering mind, and he could not accept this as a mode of communication. And Gregory Bateson rose to my defense and said it takes one to know one, and Phil's got it. So this new art form is itself kind of like, to the academic world, this is evil as the enunciation of the next level of order. To the generation of you and Mitch, you realize it's a cognitive art form. It's a performance art.
Yeah.
And so it's a disorienting shift for folks. At the same time, it can be an exciting one.
Yeah, that's, so the through line here is between, the relationship between, say, football and skateboarding, and the relationship between, say, Catholicism and post-religious spirituality, and your distinction between lectures and Wissenkunst. And then, as you mentioned, in myself and the work of other musicians like Ioto or Dixon's violin, these are people that are using multi-channel looping to create these miniature cybernetic ecologies where they're improvising all of the music night after night in relationship to this live energetic dynamic between themselves and the crowd. And it's a form of, I've come to take it, my brother is a skateboarder, and so I've come to take it as, kind of synonymous that, my work is this sort of freestyle instrumentation.
But there's a shadow side too to both these things, because the shadow side for my art form of my 70s generation, when people went to conferences all the time as a way of constellating emergent noetic qualities, there were conferences everywhere all over the planet. You could earn a living just hopping from one to another if you were a Bill Thompson or a Terence McKenna. I put my kid through Amherst College by lecture fees. But if you get enraptured narcissistically with yourself and you inflate the way I think Ken Wilber inflated and can only talk down to people as, the man who synthesized everything, then that kind of psychic inflation creates a kind of guru derangement, and you become completely inauthentic. And I think in the same way with your art form of your generation, that as you project the image to the audience and you riff with yourself, it can become kind of like a closed loop, a kind of like an electronic way of giving yourself your own blowjob instead of your girlfriend. So you really have to watch out for the implosive narcissism that's in the genre.
Well, so that's a good point to bring up. I got to that point with it where I realized that this was unsatisfying, because it's basically just up there with me playing on myself. Like you said, that this music gets to a certain point where it moves beyond being interesting as a new performance modality and becomes kind of a stale gimmick after a while, and then it becomes a trap. It becomes a prison. Yeah. And so one of the things that I've been experimenting with in the last year is this new mode that I call Looper's Night, where I'm using all of the same equipment, but I'm calling up other musicians and amateur members of the audience to contribute their own musical input. And they're running, rather than running myself through my looping equipment, I'm running other people through it. And
so you're riffing with others, yeah.
Well, it's like I'm doing the same sort of like orchestral multi-channel looping, but I'm doing it where I'm remixing other people's live musical input on the spot. And that's been really profound, because that's where it starts. That's where that tendency towards guruistic narcissism starts to break down. And I'm actually using the cybernetic digital ecosystem in service of the dissolution of the audience, artist, producer, consumer boundary.
Well, the roots of that are in jazz with sidemen and, listening, taking a song and then riffing on it, with other implications that aren't the melody is only, a kind of ground base for all the elaborations, like My Funny Valentine, Chet Baker versus Miles Davis. So that has deep roots in musical performance qualities of spontaneity and improvisational art, as opposed to working from a script like Beethoven's Ninth.
Right. And so to get back to your these quotes that I loved of yours from Exodus's Revolution, and I'll just send these echo these back to you across the ages here, and let you riff on them. And I think that we've been on this call for 2 hours, so it's a good place to.
Yeah, I was about to say we should sort of pull the plug.
But you got these three quotes that I feel really kind of create this trifecta here. And one is, before we rule with armies, we rule with explanations, and the armies are really only the outermost external structure of an explanation.
Wow, I say that. That's really cool.
That was an hour and 8 minutes in.
I remember saying that. Wow.
Yeah. So that's that's getting to this whole issue where we're moving from direct. We're in a constant state of cybernetic warfare, but the actual number of military casualties per capita has dramatically dropped over the centuries. At least by some people's measure. Another one is no revolution can succeed in history because the ends of revolution require the end of history. In the sense, I guess, that myth is this timeless and cyclical narrative that occurs all at once, whereas history is this thing that moves.
In the Paris Commune, the communards shot the hands off the clocks to indicate that history had ended and stopped, and this was the rise. The Paris, commune was kind of like a proto-Woodstock. It was an emergence of a new phenomenon that wasn't. It was totally it was an autonomous zone, in Hocking-Bay's sense, and of course it was brutally put down by the army, and the communards were all slaughtered. So it was, an unhappy foreshadowing. And what's your third quote?
Well, in that same sense that it was shot down, one of the things that Terence loved to talk about was how Descartes was in the army that raided the Bohemian kingdom of Prince Frederick and shut down his alchemical experiment. And then it was after that, that Descartes had his angelic vision that launched us into the scientific age. So in a sense, there's something really, there's that whole shamanic initiation that you were talking about, and it leads right into the third and final quote, which is, grace can only come to the defeated.
Yeah, that's often the case of prophetic, charismatic personalities, if you look at them historically, are not what we think of charisma in a media celebrity society. They're actually stutterers, failures. The guy who created the typing revolution failed at his Confucian exams. Moses was a failure. Moses is a classic example, the one that I was talking about in those lectures years ago. And so Patrick Pierce was a kind of antisocial, probably repressed gay guy who had lots of issues going on, and he became the founding president of the Irish Republic and was shot by the British. So oftentimes the failure is part of this transition. And Hitler, of course, is the classic example of the failed artist becoming the revolutionary, the artist Monkey, as Peter Varick explored in his book on Hitler and metapolitics. So failure is, as many people have often remarked, the key to success. And I didn't have the grades at LA High to get into a good school like Pomona. They let me in as a maverick, and I sort of talked my way in. So I, from the classical sense of my girlfriend's father, was a high school dropout and a failure. And he was always astonished when I went on to become an MIT professor and, won a Wilson, the graduate study at Cornell, because he had me programmed as the classic, high school dropout, working class failure. So failure is very critical in the transformation because you have to be willing to take the risk, to fail, not to play it safe, to go, to your edge, and to move away from society and its canons of what success are. You have to know what to say no to. So my image is, if you're a bird in the springtime building a nest for the next generation, you have to know when to stop, otherwise the nest becomes a cage. So there's a point in which form is necessary to hold something, in the Tao Te Ching way. The part of the purpose of the cup comes from the part of the cup that is not. That's what's going to hold the tea. But you have to know when to stop, and religions don't stop, then they become containers. And so what I found, in order to live my life as an artist, Wissenskunstler, poet, whatever, is what to say no to, and when to say no, to things or technologies, and what to be open to. You can't unilaterally say, let's go back to nature and all technology is evil and just become, a Luddite, because that's not going to work either. So again, it's skillful means. It's upaya. It's the middle path.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that judging, trying to navigate that same middle path, my decision was to go ahead with a device that has turned out to be the most socially awkward and alienating imaginable thing. Everywhere I go, people regard me like I'm a spy if I'm wearing this thing. And honestly, it became very difficult to wear it. I wore it into the mall where there's like 18 cameras trained on everyone at any given time. And there was a guy waiting in line to buy the new iPhone that reads your fingerprint. And I looked at him and I kind of, I reached up to the side to take a picture and I said, smile, and he goes, "Don't record me, bro." I was like, are you joking? Like, it's totally stigmatic, but at the same time, there is something about stigma and how it creates that distance from the society required in order to make a substantial change.
Beginning of that project, when you started, that you were the heroic canary in the mine. You were going to test this out for the rest of us and become a victim if that's what it was.
Yeah. So, well, at any rate.
All right, Michael. Well, we've been rapping for a long time. So, at any rate, have a Merry Christmas, whatever your religious persuasion is. And I will, see you in cyberspace whenever.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Bill.
Okay, take care.